Okay, let's talk about behavioralism or behaviorism and how it applies to the classroom. Okay, so behavioral approaches, lessons for teachers. So, whoa, I'm way far back. Let's try back at slide 1 instead. That's the end game. There we go. Okay, so understanding learning. So obviously this is kind of like a context for how we learn behaviors. Has a lot to do with classroom management and keeping control, more so than the mechanism of learning itself, which is really to deal more with cognition and how we actually encode things into memory. That's yet to come. So that's more cognitive psychology. So if we talk about control in classroom behavior, that's really what we're focusing on here. It allows for the conditions of learning. That's probably the best way of describing it. So learning, from your textbook's definition, is a process in which experience causes permanent change in knowledge, behavior, or potential for behavior. So again, it's that whole behavior potential for behavior here. The knowledge, they're gaining knowledge of content and it's being reinforced or it's being punished in one way or another. Must be brought about by experience. So they experience through one form of means, and then obviously there's conditions put in of reinforcements or punishments that allow us to repeat those behaviors or extinguish those behaviors over time. So it's not a change brought about by maturation, illness, drugs, hunger, such. You don't learn to be hungry. You can learn to live with hunger and manage it. That's a different story, but those are natural conditions that are brought on. The hunger is not the drugs or the illness that allow us to use the behavior. And again, it's something that's a neutral condition. Behavioral psychologists focus on changes in behavior that are observable and measurable. That's really what we're talking about. So the neuroscience of behavioral learning, there's a growing knowledge about areas of the brain, and they talk about some of those structures involving learning new behaviors. So there's associations between environmental stimuli, brain systems, and behavioral responses. The overall behavioral learning processes that they talk about in the chapter are contiguity learning, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. Contiguity learning really has to do a lot with classical conditioning because you're talking about paired stimuli, which lead towards classical conditioning, and then operant conditioning has to do with just basically reinforcing or punishing novel behaviors that just occur or behaviors that are already in a repertoire in an animal or human being. Observational learning, we're learning from some form of example. Now, that doesn't have to be particularly cited, and we're going to get to that as well. Early explanations of learning, contiguity, and classical conditioning. So the idea is we're associating in contiguity, we're associating two events in repeated pairs. So they keep showing up together, right? So you're learning by association. So let's say your father always yells when he comes home from work. You're going to associate your father coming home from work from probably some kind of nauseous stimulus or some kind of anxiety-provoking stimulus. So the stimulus occurs, the event that activates the behavior, and response follows, observable reaction to the stimulus. Classical conditioning is when we would throw something else into the work, so something else that goes on. So let's say that your father stamps his feet before he walks through the door, and then the anxiety provoking begins because he starts to shout. So that stamping of the feet then, which is just a neutral stimulus of him getting the mud off of his boots, starts to provoke the same anxiety response that wasn't there previously. So then anybody that stamps boots, you hear stamping boots around you, the anxiety is provoked. So even if it happens to be in a novel situation, a different environment, that still is going to happen. Okay. Yeah, you get it. So that's what that slide is. So classical conditioning, obviously you've seen the dog video, so you know what we're talking about there. I'm not going to really go through the steps in the process. You got that already through the video. And my example of your father at the door stamping his boots. Unconditioned and conditions. The unconditioned stimulus is the stimulus that automatically produces emotional physiological responses. Your father coming through the door. Unconditioned response, the natural occurring emotion physiological response, the anxiety. Conditioned stimulus, the stimulus that evokes emotional psychological response after conditioning, the stamping of the boots. Conditioned response, learning a response to previously neutral stimuli. Stamping the boots causes anxiety. The application to Pavlov's dog, so in the dog experiment, the sound initially is neutral. Food is the US, salivation is the UR. In time, sound is a CS, salivation is a CR. So that's the learning response to the sound. So applying classical conditioning, associate positive, pleasant events with learning tasks. So they talk about things of making reading pleasant by creating comfortable reading corners with pillows, colorful displays of books. Traditionally in classroom environment, why we use bright primary colors, things like that, to make the classroom perhaps a more pleasant place. Then you're associating pleasantry with learning. Of course, if we introduce some negative stimuli in there, right, then that's going to hurt the condition, right? It's going to cause it a certain polarity. Help students to risk anxiety producing situations voluntarily and successfully. Okay, so if we have a low risk environment in the fact that it's an environment that you allow for failure without high punishment, then it's a situation in which students feel safe taking risks and volunteering. So that allows students that type of environment that's, of course, also intolerant of people making fun of other people. So that would be the control in the situation. So allow students with fear of public speaking to present to small groups first. So that's kind of a scaffolding approach to it. You work your way up. Also, though, if you have a zero tolerance at bullying each other in class and the teacher keeps strict control on that, it's more likely that children are going to feel safe in that environment and be able to be vocal and speak in an open forum without criticism. Help students recognize differences, similarities among situations so they can discriminate and generalize. So the idea is, you want them to avoid strangers who offer gifts, rides. They may accept favors from adults when the parents are present. So again, you're pairing the parents with being okay. So you're extrapolating out on when it's okay to receive something, when it's not okay to receive something. Okay, so if we talk about operant conditioning, and which you saw the Sheldon Big Bang Theory version of it, so it's voluntary in terms of the behavior, what the behavior is that's exhibited. Generally, goal-directed behavior is emitted by a person or an animal. So it's something that we're targeting in terms of a behavior that we want to strengthen. For instance, whales jumping out of the water and breaching, or coming up and doing something silly at SeaWorld. So we strengthen or weaken voluntary behavior by consequences or antecedents. So a bell rings, and then the animal does the trick on demand, and then it's rewarded. So if you look at the Skinner example, right, it's based on the view that classical conditioning accounts for a small portion of learned behavior, not all learned behavior. So the idea here is behavior sandwiched between two sets of environmental influences. Something that happens before the behavior, and then something that happens after the behavior. Okay? So if you look at this model here, the idea is that consequences influence whether behavior is repeated through reinforcement. or it can be punishment as well. In this case, it's the reinforcing model. So the behavior's exhibited, we throw the whale a sardine, and then that behavior is going to happen again and again because the animal believes that they're going to get a sardine every time they do that behavior. Same thing happens with my dog, with Trip. So when he was younger, every time you call him, he comes inside from outside, and you throw him a cookie. He believes that every time he goes outside and comes back in, he's going to get a cookie. So that's why it's important to probably put the animal, in this case, on a reinforcement schedule so they don't get a cookie every time, but the behavior is repeated, that anytime you call the animal comes to you. So positive reinforcement. So the idea is we strengthen behavior by adding a desired stimulus after the behavior, a cookie. Compliments received when you wear a new outfit. So if you're complimented when you receive a new outfit, it might cause your behavior to go out and buy more new outfits, or you're likely to wear the new outfit again. Peers laugh when a child falls out of the chair. The child, if he likes attention, will repeat the behavior. If he doesn't like the attention, he'll make sure that he doesn't fall out of the chair again. So then it becomes an individual difference, right? There's a discrepancy model in each individual and whether they're going to find the actual behavior a reinforcement or a punishment. So the behavior may occur even when a reinforcer is not positive from the teacher's perspective. So bad behavior gets teacher's negative attention. Child likes attention and repeats the bad behavior. Teacher adds desired stimulus because the child sees consequences, attention as positive. Any attention. Maybe they don't get any attention home. So the child does something to get the teacher to cause, again, the punishment in this case, which is the negative attention. So, but unfortunately, it's reversed and it's become a reinforcer. Negative reinforcement, subtraction of the stimulus. So you're taking the stimulus away. Strengthens behavior by removing or subtracting an adversive stimulus after the behavior occurs. Your textbook example is a teacher that says, okay, you guys know everything. I'm going to give you a test. First part of the test is fact-finding. The second part of the test is group work, writing a script. Teacher knows that the group work, writing a script, they're going to want to do in a group, right? So the teacher says, if you do the first part quietly and behaving, then the second part, then I'm going to give you time to do it in pairs, right? In this case, they're taking the negative stimulus away. So if the child fears about getting a report, gets sick, or is melandering and pretends the child's sick, misses the report, the child then becomes conditioned, in this case not conditioned, but reinforced in the fact that, hey, that negative thing was taken away from me. So if I fake being sick every time, then that's going to be a way of me getting out of the expected outcome, which happens to be giving the oral report. So it strengthens that negative behavior, unfortunately. Punishment. So the process that weakens or suppresses behavior. So a behavior happens, then there's a punishment. So hopefully we want to weaken or decrease the behavior. Okay? Presentation punishment. So you decrease the behavior by adding an adverse stimuli following the behavior. Removal punishment decreases behavior by removing a pleasant stimuli following the behavior. So let's say we actually do, let's do it this way. So a child raises its hand in class, his or her hand in class. The teacher, let's do it this way. The child actually shouts out the answer in class. The teacher scolds the child. Then the child learns that the child needs to raise his or her hand before and be called on before actually answering the question. Okay? Now, decreases the behavior by adding an aversive stimulus. In this case, it's the verbal scolding. It could be timeout. It could be several different punishments. If we're talking about removing a punishment, it decreases the behavior by removing a pleasant stimulus following the behavior. If I allowed that child to shout out and I actually answer that child in class and let them address the class, then I've reinforced that behavior, right, of not following the parameters of the class rules. So we distinguish between negative reinforcement and punishment. So reinforcement is both positive and negative and increases behavior. Punishment suppresses behavior. So its outcome is to stop a behavior from happening. Reinforcement schedules are simply the fact that we can put them on rotation. So I don't need to reinforce the behavior every time. So in the Big Bang Theory model of it, Sheldon was throwing Penny a chocolate every time she showed a behavior that he wanted to reinforce. Eventually, you want to move to a more intermittent reinforcement schedule, so the subject is guessing whether they're going to get it or not. That it's not all the time, because then it becomes a persistent behavior that might be too frequently occurring. Again, like my dog going in and out of the house and getting a reinforcement every time that happens. So there's two types of intermittent reinforcement schedules. There's interval scheduling, so fixed or variable. So it's a reinforcement based on the length of time between reinforcers. So I could do it every third time, okay, every fourth time. Goes in and out of the house. Ratio schedule, so fixed or variable. Again, reinforcement based on the number of responses between reinforcers. Well, so length of time, sorry, my bad. The length of time is actually physical length of time. So I could say it's, every 2 days, right? Ratio schedule would be every third, every fourth time the behavior occurs. Extinction, but the problem is when we stop reinforcing behaviors that are good behaviors, then the behavior goes away. It extinguishes, so it disappears over time because there's no more reinforcer that goes with the stimulus. So that's why we keep it on a schedule. That's the idea. Antecedents and behavioral changes. So again, in the operant conditioning model, the idea is that there's events that precede the behavior. So for Skinner, it was the either spinning of a word that says peck or turn, or a red dot that the chicken has or the pigeon has to peck before it can release food into the dish. So the pigeons peck and get food when a light is on, but not when the light's off. So the idea is that they learn to discriminate between two conditions, right, or more conditions. This is effective behaviorally because then students can judge in what condition they will be reinforced for a particular behavior. If we talk about cues, we talk about basically, again, it's kind of scaffolding. So the idea is you're giving clear, specific instructions that communicate the expected results. Now that can be behavior, but that can also be in terms of assessment and process. So if you are calling a child up to the board and you're asking them, please do this, using a smart board and it's a drag and drop activity, you make clear directions on what the child's expected to drag, what the child's expected to drop, and the parameters of the actual game that you're playing. Without any of those conditions, if you don't have any of those conditions in terms of expectations, the child is set up to fail in terms of cues. And then depending on how you reinforce or punish based on what comes next, you as teacher become at fault for not having given enough scaffolding to get the child where the child needs to be and then reinforcing or punishing that behavior. Okay, so then if we talk about applied behavioral analysis, so the idea is it's the application of behavioral learning principles to understand and change behavior, again, over time, because time is a component. So it's sometimes called behavioral modification. If we use any of these systems that we just talked about, including modeling, then that's really, and reinforcement for modeling, appropriate behaviors, then it becomes a systematic approach, which is behavioral modification. So steps in classroom application of applied behavioral analysis clearly specify behavior to be changed and the goal. Observe, note current behavior, so the frequency, the causes, surroundings, time of day. So we talk about a child being off task, right, as the focus goal. We want the child on task. When's it happening? Why is it happening? Okay. And the plans for the intervention in using the antecedents. So what occurs before the child goes off task that is the antecedent. And then we track the results and modify the plan as needed. Methods for encouraging behaviors, reinforcing with teacher attention. So praise for good behavior, which is really the PBS model. So it's praise for good behavior and ignore misbehaviors. Effective praise must be systematic and believable. So if you have a sarcastic tone to your voice, you don't have a rapport with the child doesn't believe what you're saying, then you've already lost the battle. It's not going to be valid. It's not going to be weighty in terms of reinforcement because the child is not looking for your reinforcement. They've been disenfranchised from the process. Guidelines for using praise appropriately: be clear, systematic, tied directly to appropriate behavior. So you need to be able to quantify what the behavior was, right, and qualify what the behavior was. Appreciative, not evaluative. So, I like how you did that 7 times. So it's really nice to see you cooperating with other students. That's it. Praise action, not the person. So it's not Johnny, good job. It's Johnny, I like the way you did this particular behavior. Or that's nice that you did that for a friend. Based on individual abilities and limitations, focused on student progress, not comparisons to others. It's an individual plan. It's not meant to be blanket, although it's much treated that way in school systems. This is predicated on the fact that we have a behavioral analysis on every child and where we want the child to be in terms of behavior and what can be fixed along the way. Attributed to effort and ability, not luck, extra help, or easy material. So again, it's a system, right? It's meant to be something that's reinforced and there's a schedule over time. It's not luck, it's not haphazard. Reinforcing to the individual, not used to influence the class. Genuine accomplishment of met goal, not for less. So you don't praise because you're thinking about, it's the idea of exercise. So in terms of reinforcement, so the idea is, if I go to gym, I'm allowed to have this chocolate if I burn 600 calories. If I thought about going to the gym, that's not to reward that and give the chocolate because I thought about giving it. There's a benchmark for the behavior, the target behavior that needs to be met. So selecting reinforcers. Well, this is kind of like the example that I gave you before. So the Premack 1965 idea that you can use a rewarding task even though it's still a task, a curricular task. So like working in a group to accomplish something. But they have to complete, say, writing out their spelling words first, right? Or working on their spelling lists first before they get to do the cool stuff that they want to do. So we hold one over the other to try to motivate to get the student and then reinforce them by a task that they're more interested in doing. Shaping, so successful approximations. So this takes and spins it just a little bit differently than the diet version that I just gave, or the exercise version I just gave you as an example. So metabolize this one, like think about this one as baby steps. So as we go up through a process, we have small incremental steps along the way that are measurable. So, if I'm talking about saying writing like persuasive essay, and the first step is to write a hypothesis. So that's step one. I can reinforce that behavior for this successful written hypothesis. And then the student understands how to take a point of view. So the student takes a point of view, can explain that, and can back it up with 3 resources and cite those. So that's the next step in the process. So the idea is it becomes a task analysis, these breaking down into small steps and rewarding those small steps to reshape the entire behavior. Now, we can do that in terms of academics, like I just said, or we can also do it in terms of behavior. So if we have a scale of positive reinforcements for every step along the way, if I want to, I can talk about like a drug or alcohol rehab program. If there's 12 steps to the program, successfully completing the 12 steps will have reshaped your behavior, right? That's the idea. Positive practice, so practicing correct responses immediately after errors. Correction needs to be immediate. It's a big issue if we're not correcting either behaviors or academics right when they occur. So if it's an academic issue, you want correction to occur immediately so they learn from the mistake. And again, that's high tolerance for failure in a non-high stakes environment. So that's the idea. Effective when the students make academic errors. So correct an academic error as soon as possible. Practice the correct response immediately. Positive practice over correction. So practice correct behavior until it becomes almost automatic. Use this when the student breaks the classroom rule. Okay, so even though we're not allowed to do this anymore, the process of, say, writing something over and over again on the board, again, from a legal perspective, not the most appropriate thing to do. But if you had the child write over and over again on the board, it becomes an entrenched cognition, right? It's an entrenched idea because I've done that over and over and over again. Better than writing it is actually to have the behavior in practice over and over again until it becomes automatic. So if I talk about something, again, a simple example is no tolerance for, let's say, putting recycling in a garbage pail, right? So if I reinforce the students by giving them praise, yeah, good job, you got it in the right pail. Or negative reinforcements, no, you don't do that. Put it in the recycling, it's paper. Eventually, if we do that over and over again, then chances are that the behavior is going to get shaped to be the correct behaviors over time. But again, it needs to be methodical. It needs to be something that has method to it, and the correction's always there. Okay, so guidelines, applying operant conditioning to encouraging positive behaviors. So you recognize positive behaviors in ways students value. So positive consequences for following rules. Second chance for honest admissions of mistakes. So if we look at behavioral theory and gaming theory, there's a notion put out there by Hamilton originally in the fact that animals, when they cooperate with each other, they usually allow to get burnt once, right? So it's what Hamilton refers to as tit for two tats. So I'll let you burn me once, but the second time around, I won't let that happen. Okay, so you can make the mistake once, and then I won't reinforce or punish that, but make the mistake twice, and then I'll start doing that in terms of punishment. Give plenty of reinforcement with the new skills and material. Reinforce on unpredictable schedule for encouraging persistence after new behaviors are established. So you got to keep them on a schedule. Otherwise, the behavior gets extinguished, right? Surprise rewards for getting into groups quietly. So if it's a behavior that you're happy with, then a reward needs to happen. Again, Premack principle, so you guys get the idea of the fact that you give something a little more nauseous before you give something that's a reinforcer. If it's something that needs to happen, you use the more reinforcing task as a principle in your classroom to reinforce the more nauseous one, right? That you hold that over the students as the golden nugget. Use cueing to help establish new behaviors and give praise, privileges, rewards to all students when they do something well. Establish a variety of reinforcers. Probably not all candy. Token reinforcement is the idea of creating a token economy. All right, so this really comes from what I deem as the prison model of good behavior. So you are a model prisoner and you're exuding proper behavioral targets. I give you a token, this wooden token, that hopefully you don't make into a shiv. I give you this wooden token, and the wooden token, after you collect so many of them, you can trade in on something like pop, like a Coke or something like that, which really actually happens in prisons. I worked in a medium security prison in the psych assessment wing for a year, and this is something that goes on in terms of positive behavioral reinforcement techniques. So in behavioral modification and keeping them in control. Any person that's institutionalized as a mechanism of control to create the antecedents, the condition of behavior you want, token economy has always been a good idea. So we have things today instead like that really are the same kind of things. So if we have points up on a board or check marks on a board, or if you start with X number of check marks on the board for each student and they get decreased over the course of the week because of negative behaviors. So that's either way, it's functioning as a physical shared view of who's doing what when, right? So it's transparent, everybody can see it. So there's a little peer and social learning dynamic to that because I learn from other people's behaviors and what is going to get me in trouble and take points away or get me points. And the other fact there is that we are going through some form of token economy because whatever behaviors, whatever reinforcements there because I have X number of points or whatever punishments there because I don't have X number of points, it becomes a reinforcement schedule. So, if we talk about behavioral assessments to figure out exactly why the behavior is occurring, general reasons that students act out are they're receiving attention from others, they're escaping unpleasant situations, academic or social demands, they do it to get a desired item or activity, and to meet sensory needs. So the idea is when we're doing a functional behavioral assessment to figure out why the behavior is occurring. Again, it's like I've said previously, it's a behavior, it's not you. Okay, so it has nothing to do with you per se, but it has something to do with their repertoire of behavior and how we need to shape that over time. So we need to collect information of what's happening right before the behaviors and then the consequences of the problem behavior. So what's happening after is a child being reinforced and punishment. Are we thinking that we're punishing the child and the child sees that as reinforcement? We use a variety of ways to gather the information. It's not just observation. We can use frequency scales, etc. We analyze to determine what functions the behavior serves, because there's got to be an outcome, right? Through either, if we're a behavioralist, we believe that there's either a punishment or a reinforcement attached to the actual behavior. In positive behavioral supports, or PBS, it's a school-wide usually or district-wide intervention program to replace problem behavior with new actions that serve the same purpose. So this kind of blends out with what is called in psychology as schema-based psychology or schema-based theory or therapy, in the fact that we're actually replacing our current schemes or our current ways of operating with a different alternative way of operating. So we teach students to ask for help or request a break. So we're giving them alternatives to what currently they're doing, which could be, thoroughly difficult behavior. It is required by IDEA, but again, I want you to think in terms of the schema, because you need to give the replacement behavior, because not every child is going to come up with the novel desired behavior. Traditionally, how this is done in schools is, young men and young women behave like this. Well, I hate to tell you, but that actually is a schema. So that's the target behavior that we're looking at. But how do we actually get to what that looks like as an outcome? What are the steps that are involved in getting them from point A to point B in terms of schemas, right, to rechange the behavior? So instead of a child with, say, oppositional defiance disorder picking up a chair and throwing it at the teacher, we give alternatives. Okay, if you need a break because you're feeling angry, here's your safe place where you go in the building, right? So that's your place until you're ready to come back. That's the alternative. That's the strategy. That's the schema that we're replacing, rather than the boiling point of which the child elicits the behaviors. Self-management, use behavioral learning principles to change own behavior. So the idea is we have goal setting for students that have target behaviors that we want to change. Monitoring and evaluating progress. So again, that's really good for systems like Classroom Dojo. And if you haven't looked at it, take a look at it. It's kind of a badge system, but it does go through, it creates visual reinforcements. And even though there's no monetary value or anything else associated with them, children seem to have stake in them because there could be a competitive nature to it, and there is a visual aspect to it. Okay, so when we talk about bridging out and working with families, we obviously have to be transparent and introduce the system of how we're managing behavior in the classroom to the parents, okay, in a positive way. Help family students establish reachable goals. So again, incremental goals that go up a scale over time. Suggest goals such as beginning homework early. Give families ways to record, evaluate progress. Divide work into easily measured steps. Gives families a form or checklist. Provide models of good work when needed. So if they need to learn from example, that's modeling, right? So the idea is if they're looking at a sample, then they can work from that sample of what the exceptional level of work is and try to reach that target. It's not cheating. It's giving them a sample of what the target academic behavior happens to be. Start with frequent checkups and then fewer checkups. I hate to tell you, that's a reinforcement schedule. Behavioral approach, lessons for teachers. So principles teachers can use to apply to all people. No one eagerly repeats behaviors that have been punished. Again, the punishment needs to fit the crime, though, and the punishment needs to be removed relatively quickly. Gone are the days where the student spends the entire day with the dunce cap in the corner on a stool. But we can have brief periods. So brief periods of things like time out if the child is not meeting the target behaviors. Okay, but a brief word about timeout and the fact that it's an individual nature. Okay, so I have two children. One child is very social. The other child is not very social. The social child, if you take him away from all the normal stimulus around him, will sit and cry when in timeout. The other child that does not mind being alone and can even turn his fingers into toys if the need be as stimulus or input has no problem with being put in timeout because that child desires that condition. So you have to be very wary about the individual basis of reinforcement and punishment for each individual student. Unless you build a rapport and you know what the desire is of those students, then you're not going to effectively impose either a punishment or a reinforcer because you don't know what makes them tick. When actions lead to consequences that are positive, actions are likely to be repeated. I study, I get an A, I'm probably going to study again. Teachers often fail to use reinforcement to recognize appropriate behavior. So I'm not going to worry about reinforcing the positive stuff, but I'm certainly going to punish the negative stuff. Okay, that's a problem. It's actually the inverse of the PBS model, of which you reinforce the positive behaviors and you somewhat ignore negative behaviors. Although if there's a code in place in a particular school, you need to still follow whatever code is going by. Praise must be sincere recognition of real accomplishment to be effective. So again, unless you actually have a relationship with your students, and you have that, that magic word of rapport, you're neither going to harm them nor are you going to praise them, and it's going to be effective in terms of shaping their behavior. So in this case, in essence, the relationship factor in behavioralism between human beings is insurmountably important. So as I've alluded to earlier, by participating with students, sitting down with lunch, talking to them about their likes and dislikes, understanding them, understanding their living arrangements, understanding how they learn effectively, understanding who their groups are that they run with through something like a sociogram that eventually you'll be able to just build in your head through observation. Unless we do all of these factors, you're not doing everything to build that rapport with the students, to understand what makes them tick, and then any behavioral strategy is not really going to be effective. Again, either side of it, either the punishment side of it or the reinforcement side of it. And that's the end of that.